Hand of the Day.
Hey guys, it's Alec Torelli, and welcome back to an episode of the Hand of the Day. Today's hand comes from the Full Tilt $1 Million Cash game, and it's between two of the legends of the game, Phil Ivey and Gus Hanson. One thing to keep in mind during this hand is that we are playing six-handed, and that's going to change dramatically the types of hands that both players are going to be playing, especially when it comes to pre-flop. Of course, the less players that are at the table, the more that you can justify opening up your game and playing more hands.
12.
Raised to 2,000.
Yeah, so
That's
sure, bet 20.
2,000 total.
Interesting. Gus Hanson with
save in
a
case you have
somewhat
nuts.
similar hand to Phil Ivey's.
Save something.
Yeah, those
Check.
hands are very connected.
Raise to 6,600.
It's a lot of flops that fit these two hands, where we could see some really good action.
The only question is, are we going to see a flop? Gus Hanson is 3-bet this. Benjamin not going to call it the ace-10.
Cool.
Madison not going to call it the ace-9.
So when we see Phil Ivey here open raising under the gun with 10-8 of diamonds, while that would be too loose of a play in a 9-handed cash game, in a 6-max game, when of course you also have the talent of Phil Ivey and you're 200 big blinds deep, this is definitely a reasonable hand to mix it up with. It's great because it gives you what is called board coverage, meaning on different types of board textures, especially those that are low boards like 6, 7, 8 type of boards, you are going to have a hand that is actually playable. If you only raise with super premium hands and Broadway cards, then anytime the board comes low, your opponents are going to know that you're never going to have a big piece of that and can apply a lot of pressure on you and put you to tough decisions. So in short, I do like mixing it up with different types of hands, especially those that cover lower boards, and this in a 6-handed game is definitely a good one to do it with. While I would prefer to have something like 8-7 suited, 10-8 of diamonds is definitely in the mix. Phil Ivey opens to 2,000 under the gun, folds around to Gus Hanson on the button with Jack-9 of diamonds. Here, I feel like he has two options. Calling is definitely a reasonable option, and he could also 3-bet. Now, in this specific situation, it's not as advantageous to 3-bet just because you're playing against Phil Ivey. But in general, in this spot, hopefully you're probably not going to be playing against him in your cash game. So the thing that I would use to consider what to do here is, what is the difference in skill between myself, and I would ask humbly, how good am I versus my opponent, and how does he react to 3-bets? So if I have a skill edge over him, and he never 4-bets me, and he calls a lot or folds a lot, well, this is a great spot to 3-bet with a hand like Jack-9 of diamonds. If, on the other hand, he's very good, he's prone to 4-bet, and he's going to put you in some tough spots, maybe you just want to flat call with this hand. I'm okay with Gus 3-betting here. He makes it 6,600, folds around to Ivey, who now decides to call. I think the default play here is probably to fold. If you're facing a 3-bet and you're out of position with like a mid-suited connector, you're probably just safe to fold. But again, Phil Ivey is very confident in his game. He's playing 200 big blinds deep with a loose player like Gus, whose hand range is wider, so 10-8 of diamonds isn't going to be in as bad of shape versus a super loose player like Gus, rather than a player that you might be playing against or I might be playing against that 3-bets with a much tighter range. So I'm okay with Ivey calling here, and we go heads up to the flop.
Phil Ivey doesn't fold too many of the 3-bets.
Jack-9.
Oh, what a flop for Gus Hanson.
Check.
And you just said it. You said these cards are kind of interconnected, and they are. Phil Ivey has an open-ended straight draw on this one, but he's drawing dead.
I can tell you this much. If Gus Hanson gives a free card here and it comes Phil Ivey straight on the turn, could be bad for Phil.
Gus Hanson flops the top full house. He has the absolute nuts right now.
Bet 9,100.
Can't see Phil Ivey not at least calling here.
Well, if you're going to call a raise pre-flop with 10-8, and then you flop and open in the straight draw.
That's what you were calling to catch in the first place. Of course, the paired board and the 2 spades might keep him from coming.
Cool.
Ivey calls, pot now 32,900.
Flop comes Jack-9 with 2 spades. Ivey flops open-ended straight draw, and Gus flops absolute nuts. Ivey checks, totally standard, and now it's over to Gus. Here he has two great decisions. He can check and trap or bet and try and build a pot. Both have merit, so I'm not going to go too much into the strategy behind each one, but what I will say is you should probably mix it up here between betting and checking so that you're balanced. He decides to bet 9,100 back over to Ivey, who now I think has a clear check call. He can't fold this hand, obviously. If you're calling with 10-8 of diamonds, you hit the swap, you can't just fold. He could opt to check raise, but the reason that I think check calling is better is just because the check raise costs him so much. He's going to have to put in something like 25, probably 30,000 here to get away with that check raise, which puts him in a very compromising spot out of position on the turn if he's called. He could decide to bluff some spades, which has some merit, makes a check raise stronger, but his stack to pot ratio on the turn will be sort of small, and it's sort of an awkward spot to bet fold the turn. For that reason, I rather keep the pot small, check call. If my opponent checks behind on the turn, shows weakness, or a spade comes, or I hit my straight, I'm planning on betting on the turn or the river. Ivey check calls, let's see a turn.
A 7 or queen, and we can see some fireworks. Oh my gosh!
Check or bet?
The queen on the turn.
Bet 25,000.
Let's see if Houdini can get out of this trap.
I prefer a flat call here.
Hansen only has 99,000 behind.
He could easily shove here as well, but I prefer just like Gus Hanson did.
Turn comes a queen, which Ivey thinks is a good card for him. We know he's drawing dead, but he makes a straight, and Hansen's loving it. Ivey now bets out 25,000 into 33,000, and this, I think, is an absolutely excellent bet. I love this bet so much because if you think about how Gus is going to react in this spot, if it's checked to him, a lot of his range is going to check behind. If Gus has something like a queen, like queen 10, king queen, ace queen, or pocket kings, pocket aces, pocket 10s, 10-9, all those hands are probably going to check behind. He might also check behind with flush draws like ace king of spades, ace 10 of spades, or just any spade draw, ace 5 of spades, or anything like that, just because he doesn't want to get check raised. The pot's very big, he doesn't want to get blown off his hand. So I think it's very likely that Gus checks behind with most of his range here, but he's also going to call a bet with a lot of the range that we just talked about. So if Gus has ace queen, he's probably going to check behind if he's checked to, but he's definitely going to call a bet if Ivey bets himself. So I love that Ivey bet here. I think it's an absolutely excellent play, and when you start to understand why Ivey decided to bet here, and I believe he's doing it for the same reasons we discussed, it really shows the depth of knowledge that he has about the nuances of the game here. So I'm very impressed by Ivey's bet here. Now over to Gus, who I think has a very clear call. If Ivey's bluffing, he wants to let him bluff, and there's really no cards that hurt Gus on the river, so I'm definitely fine with calling in position, trying to get all the money in on the river.
Oh, the roux is over.
Talk about an action killer on the river.
Well, all that said, Phil Ivey might try to represent some of this, but I don't think so.
Check.
Ivey bet 25,000, Hansen called.
Now Gus is going, why didn't I shove the turn? It's actually kind of a tough spot for Gus. Does he try to value bet this? I think he turns it over. Phil led when the first queen came. He could have easily have had a queen in his hand. Maybe like a queen 10, kind of opening straight on the flop. I think that's what Gus is thinking too.
Would Phil check a queen here?
I think he would.
Bet.
And Gus bets.
This is purely a value bet.
I feel a little bit deprived. I wanted to see if Houdini could get out of the trap.
44,000 is the bet.
All I can tell you is Phil's glad he didn't have to pull a Houdini.
Yeah, the river let him off here, and Ivey should be able to get away from this one now. It's kind of a smallish bet, though. It's a $44,000 bet. Pot is $127,000.
Yeah, he bet about half the pot.
Hansen obviously wanting a call right now.
Phil Ivey wants to call so bad.
The funny thing is, if Hansen is really, really deep, he might not bet there in fear of a check raise.
I agree.
But Hansen only has 30,000 behind, so. Is there any way Gus could have had a big draw, something like
spade draw?
A spade draw with a 10, maybe even.
Absolutely. There's a lot of hands Gus could have within his range.
And he makes the
Phil Ivey can beat.
Yeah, well, he makes the continuation bet with any two.
44.
Now Ivey bets and Hansen just calls on the turn. And when Hansen calls, there's a chance, right?
Certainly is.
The river comes in offsuit queen, which actually is the one card in the deck that might actually save Ivey. He's hating it at the time. Of course, he doesn't know Gus has a boat, but he decides to check here. Very trivial check. He really can't bet for value here. It would be way too loose. Over to Gus, and I feel like a lot of people here are saying, well, Gus should definitely check because he's never going to get called by worse. But if we think, I mean, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second. While I'm with you that it's hard for Gus to get called by a worse hand because Ivey could only really have straights or maybe ace high that could call Gus. On the other side of the situation, it's really hard for Gus to be beat here. Number one, it's pretty much impossible that Ivey has a dry queen. Why? Because he's never going to check call the flop and lead the turn with just a queen. If he does have a queen somehow, he's probably going to bet the river with it too. So it's pretty impossible that Ivey has a queen. And so for that reason, I think Gus is sort of on a free roll to bet here because the worst thing that happens is he just gets called by a jack. For that reason, if I'm Gus, I'm going to bet this river here. I think it's good. It balances my range. It allows me to bluff a little bit. And I really want to focus on betting small, because I'm only going to get called if my opponent has a straight or ace high. So I think Gus should bet something like 30,000 here, giving his opponent like 5-1, which means his opponent really can't fold a straight. Gus decides to bet 44,000, giving Ivey 3-1, which means Ivey only needs to be right 25% of the time to justify calling. Against a really loose player like Gus, who's capable of a lot, and we all know it, it's really hard for Ivey to fold a straight here, even though he only beats a bluff. I can't really say that I do blame Ivey for deciding to call this river, even though he expects to lose the pot a lot of the time. If he's right 1 out of 4, he breaks even, and against a player like Gus, who definitely could miss a draw or be up to something, I think this is a reasonable spot to call.
And he doesn't. He calls, and Gus Hanson gonna win a nice pot.
I'd love to hear from you guys. Let me know your thoughts in a comment below, and I'll see you guys next time on The Hand of the Day. Thanks for watching.